Solid institutions that enjoy public confidence are an essential feature of any successful democracy. Several studies have shown that countries with strong rule of law credentials tend to be more economically stable. Most theories of judicial independence highlight the significance of judicial selection systems as a key and indispensable element of judicial independence. Therefore, it is extremely important to design judicial selection mechanisms that produce judges whose independence, integrity, and impartiality are not in doubt. In Nigeria, the judiciary holds a powerful position, watching over the creation, interpretation, and execution of the laws of the land to ensure that as much as possible there is fairness. One of the most important aspects of the judiciary is the people who serve within the system. This is why it is of paramount importance that the right people are selected to be judges. Unfortunately, the process of selecting these judges has been compromised, and the effects are meted out on the people it was created to serve.
Quality of the judicial officers that have been appointed over the years in Nigeria has witnessed a decline. Nigeria used to be a very highly rated jurisdiction when it came to the quality of its judiciary. As a matter of fact, back in the day, Nigeria was so highly rated that our judgments were being cited in other parts of the Commonwealth and in other parts of the world. And our judicial officers were actually being headhunted.
There have been concerns in recent times about the effectiveness and transparency of the judicial system, especially as it pertains to the selection process for new judges. Such problems undermine the credibility of the judicial system in Nigeria, a system that should more than any other inspire the confidence of the citizenry.
Judicial appointments in Nigeria at this time are still done without a lot of transparency. Its processes are still opaque. The system is still, to considerable extent, manipulated so that, specific outcomes can emerge from the process.
I think a background is important when you talk about appointment, because judges have been appointed in Nigeria even during colonial periods. And you recall at the time of the early part of the judicature, appointments were made by what we call tapping you on the shoulder. But before you got a tap on the shoulder from the Chief Justice or any other relevant head of court, you would have merited it because of integrity, competence, and all the relevant issues that the current NJC guidelines contain. But unfortunately, let's say it became very clear from about 1985 that the quality of the judiciary in terms of judicial officers that were, sitting on the senior courts, so High Court, Court of Appeal, and Supreme Court, it was clear that there was a dip in quality.
The judiciary has tried its best, and the NJC have also tried its best, but they have not done the work very effectively. Now, there's a problem that the judiciary has as a burden. The NJC only deals with recommendations from judicial service commissions of states. So there are 36 states. And each state will have a judicial service commission dealing with appointments to the High Court and, in some places, the customary Court of Appeal or Sharia Court of Appeal, as the case may be. Then there's another one, a Federal Judicial Service Commission, that guides appointments to federal courts like the Federal High Court, the National Industrial Court, and Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court. So the NJC's role in dealing with appointments of judges largely is smaller than what other judicial service commissions do, because the NJC only has to really ratify to a great extent what the judicial service commissions have done. And so the main problem is not just the role of the NJC, it's the role of everybody in the system, particularly at the state levels, where you have 36 states plus Abuja 37. So if you only deal with the role of the NJC in ratifying or actually doing the final recommendation, which is largely based on the recommendation of the Judicial Service Commission, you will be missing the point.
It is of utmost importance that judicial appointments be as transparent as possible and based on merit. This is why in 2014, the NJC issued its document titled Guidelines and Procedural Rules for the Appointment of Judicial Officers of all Superior Courts of Record in Nigeria, as a way to bring the system for recruiting judges and justices to the appellate court up to speed with emerging global standards, which ought to guarantee the quality and independence of mind of those appointed.
And I think the guidelines are good because if you apply the guidelines, unfortunately the NJC hasn't applied it as vigorously as it ought to. So the system of appointing judges is still very opaque. Nobody knows how it's done because it's not clear. But those guidelines were designed to create a framework for people who felt called upon to apply. There was no question of a judge applying. The judge was tapped. But as a result of decline in the status of judges and their sheer competence, we have introduced this process for them, but it's not really in effect. So that's where we are, and the impact of a very poor judicature cannot be best imagined. If people don't have confidence in the judge, the rule of law will go. So we're now at the nada, where a revolution is required to restore confidence to the judiciary.
The guidelines, even as they are at present, are not being faithfully implemented. There's no doubt about that. And the second side to it is that the guidelines themselves are not perfect. They require, in my view, and I think in the view of quite a large proportion of the profession now, and I dare say both the bar and the bench, agree that there's probably a need to revisit the guidelines and overhaul them again. But even as they are, they have not achieved the objective.
The real problem is not, in my view, the content of the NJC's rules, as much as it is the fact that even as minimal as those rules are, the NJC appears incapable, unwilling, and unable to comply with them for the most part. And therefore, judicial appointments continue to be whimsical and continue not to reflect anything like the quality of outcomes that would guarantee an impartial judicial system underpinned by integrity and competence of those who run the processes.
Has the judiciary met these recommended standards? A report by Access to Justice, a justice advocacy group, titled Making Judicial Appointments Reforms Work: How the National Judicial Council Can Improve Implementation of its Judicial Appointments Guidelines. According to the report, the appointment of judges by the NJC is flawed in 3 ways. First is the lack of compliance to publicize judicial vacancies, or publicizing such vacancies insufficiently, thus making it near impossible for those who may be interested to get the information in time, if at all.
One of the challenge which I notice is the issue of lack of wide publicity, because the guidelines provide that there is need for the process to be widely publicized. That is to send the notice to the NBA, to the website of the Judicial Service Commission, and also to circulate the notice to the heads of courts. But from what I observed, not only in my own state, but all over the country, it's like that publicity is not being made.
There are cases where they have breached the rules, for example, or they have not implemented the rules in the spirit of the objective of the rules. For example, you want to appoint 10 judges of a court. You release a notice for people to show interest today, and you close it in 4 days. You ask people at different positions like judges to make comments on a short list. You give them 24 hours or 48 hours to make comments on short list. And these things, happen almost secretly. So those are breaches of the spirit of the objective of the rules. But in spite of those breaches, when people show interest and lists are drawn up, it is that committee that decides who makes the short list. And there is no rule other than rules set by themselves. And that's where they also commit all sorts of breaches of fairness and honesty in choosing those, the short list. Where they have rushed the process within some few days and closed it. I mean, how will you say that they have fairly decided that those that are going to shortlist are those that have merited it in line with all their principles, including quota principles and federal character principles and so on and so forth. So the personality is really the problem. We can tune up the rules more, we can make the rules better, but it will still not solve the problem unless we have the people who will implement those rules, being honest.
The guidelines, what you find is that typically the NJC, the FJSC, even the State Judicial Service Commissions, they go through the motions, but they follow the letter, but they do not follow the spirit of the guidelines. I'll give you another example actually before I even speak about the federal ones. Even in Lagos State, because I also have the privilege of chairing the Judicial Relations Committee of the Lagos branch of the NBA. Let me start with Lagos. We had a situation in which during the last appointments exercise in Lagos, because the guidelines say that the NBA should be consulted, the Chief Judge of Lagos of Lagos State sent us the short list of proposed names to be sent to the NJC on a Wednesday and told us he wanted our response by Friday. Now, how do you expect the chairman of the Lagos State branch of the NBA to effectively comment on the suitability of a list of about 30 or 40 practitioners, which you sent to him on a Wednesday and you asked for him to respond by Friday? Quite clearly, that is just a tick box exercise to say, well, the guidelines said that we should ask the NBA. We've asked them, but we've already decided what we want to do anyway. We're just going through the motion.
Notify the bar and invite feedback or comments, submissions from the bar on appointments, which is a requirement of the NJC rules. So what do? The day or two, not more than 48 hours before the end of the time required for the feedback, they will send a notice to the bar asking the bar to respond. Of course, the bar will have less than 48 hours. What do you expect them to do in that situation? Quite often, the bar associations don't have the time to do so, and so they don't respond. But secondly, you're asking the bar to respond in a situation in which many of the people whom you're asking them to respond about are either interested or people before whom they have cases. And therefore, the process itself is not set up to be blind in such a way as to enable people respond credibly, intelligently, and in a manner as to produce the best outcomes.
Another issue is the opaque nature of the shortlisting process. According to the report, as the chairman of the Judicial Service Commission has subjective and non-transparent assessment to determine the outcome of the selection process. Oftentimes, the candidates personally favored by the chairman get the appointment.
When you look through the rules, you would find areas where the chief judge, who is the chairman of the Judicial Service Commission, is giving powers to make determinations without requiring the process of making those determinations to be transparent, to be, participatory. It's virtually like the rules or the guidelines give the chief judge very substantial powers to determine the outputs of the process. So it's relatively quite easy then for us to walk from the answers to the questions. You probably, if you have specific candidates you want appointed as judges, it's not a very difficult process to engineer the procedures in such a way that they would actually produce those candidates that you have in mind. Because ultimately, the guidelines say that the chief judge shall compose the shortlists of those who have expressed interest in those positions or those who have applied.
If you read the NJC guidelines, there is attestation which is supposed to be accompany the nominations, whereby the minutes of the meeting will indicate how, or will show how the candidates emerge, and also the attestation will now conclude by stating that the NJC guidelines have been complied with strictly. So if there is any breach in the guidelines, by the guidelines in the nomination process, it should not be, the blame should not be apportioned to the chairman only, because it is the entire commission. Because if members of the commission do not allow it, it will not happen.
The chairman is generally the chief judge of that state. But it's not only the chairman's influence that comes to bear on that process. Even the members, they can, in many cases, decide to allocate quotas to themselves. If you allocate quota, you are likely not to follow the principle of fairness and merit and so on and so forth. There's also the influence of the state. Most members of the Judicial Service Commissions of States are appointed by the governor. And therefore, the governor, in many cases, dictates to them who to pick as a nominee for judgeship. So the problem is actually the attitudinal problem of the members of these bodies, not actually the body itself.
And finally, in relation to selections for appellate appointments, that is, appointments to the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, the system is partial in favor of candidates who hold judicial offices, while it is biased against those who hold no such offices. Although the Judicial Appointment Guidelines provides that persons who meet the constitutional qualifications and possess the requisite track record can be considered for Supreme Court appointments, no person outside of serving justices of the Court of Appeal have been appointed into the court.
The problem we've had, or the problem we're having now with the refusal thus far to inject fresh thinking into the appellate courts, is that there's a tendency for our appellate courts to all be cut from the same cloth. So these are people who have common shared experiences, common and shared way of thinking. So there's very little diversity.
Players in the justice sector have different perspectives. So if you imagine the justice sector as a cake, the legal profession is a big slice of it. Academia is a big slice. The judicial, component of it is also a big slice. But I think that the judicial decisions that come out of the courts will be all the poorer if a couple of the slices of the cake are not being felt. So Supreme Court, generally speaking, they haven't felt the slice of cake that contains the professorial minds of law, the legal giants, the Mwabezes of this world. They haven't felt them.
Sadly, the outcome of all of these abuses is the quality of the judiciary is awful. In many places, there are still very outstanding judges in the system, but they're a minority by and large, and many of them are endangered. Many of them also will probably not leave the first instance courts to which they were originally appointed, because the system now, unlike before, is afraid of excellence and transcendence. And so if you're seen as a committed judge who is honest and who is intelligent and who wants to do the right thing, by and large, you're not going to survive into higher levels or echelons of the judiciary unless a miracle happens.
For Nigeria to achieve her full potential, her judicial system must be better. And a major step in the right direction is to have a system that has a transparent, open, and fair appointment process.
Given what we've already identified as the decline in the quality of judicial appointments over the years, it's quite clear that the guidelines are not achieving that objective.
Public confidence in the judiciary is getting lower and lower. There's been some researches, there's been some surveys done, and there seems to be one unanimous answer: the judiciary is we are losing our judiciary.
It is a matter of urgency that the judicial appointment process in Nigeria be improved, perhaps overhauled.
If the system is running in such a way that it's able to recruit our best foot forward, the very best of talents that's available in our society, if we manage to find people who have all of these characteristics, our judiciary will certainly improve. It will be stronger, it will be able to defend the rule of law, it will be able to assert its independence.
For every set of appointments or elevations within the judiciary, there should be a fixed quota, no matter how small, for introducing diversity into the courts. So if you're appointing even at entry level, it shouldn't be just people in the magistracy that are being considered for appointments to the High Court. But there should be a fixed quota for people in practice, for people from academia, etc. And ditto, when you're elevating or appointing to the Court of Appeal, there should also be a quota.
It should be clearly stated in the guidelines that whoever is nominated or whoever expressed interest to be nominated as a superior court judge should be allowed to sit for proficiency examination. That should be compulsory. It should not be allowed to be at the discretion of the commissions.
Tests should be mandatory, and that a proper system should be put in place to ensure that those tests, the testing process, cannot be subverted.
There is need for the interview being conducted at the NJC to be given wide publicity. Wide publicity in the sense that there is need for it to be shown live, either via social media platforms or national television.
Allow more time. You shouldn't rush appointment of judges. So start early. Start the process early. Give people time to show interest. Put it up in the public newspapers or public places, websites. Let everybody have a say. Judgeship is not an ordinary appointment. It's not like any other post in the world. It's something I always describe as not God level, but higher than human level. So you must support it to work well. If we don't support it, we'll all be beneficiaries of the deficiency that we have been seeing in the system.
My hope is that many more people will get involved in actually addressing these issues, and that we can all then become a critical mass of voices in a way that enables us to address this much more effectively.
So I think a lot of pressure, this sort of thing you're doing and where it will go, is very helpful for civil society working on the access to justice side, like access to justice, it may be important to, really engage the system. I know the MD has tried, but maybe it's time to come together and look at, administration of justice. So not just the appointment component, which is important, but there are a couple of critical nuggets. Speed of justice, for instance, rules of court, procedure. Do we still need to wear wigs and gown in court? These are critical things to put out for the incoming president of Nigeria 2023. What is the agenda for the judiciary? We need to hear that.
We must do whatever it takes to ensure that the judiciary is the bastion of hope, truth, and justice it was envisioned to be, so that all may have access to justice.